Welcome to another weekly Forex forecast for week 42. We had conflicting data out of the US last week. We had slightly hotter than expected CPI and then worse than expected unemployment claims, which then at the end is kind of a non-event. There is neither bullish nor bearish for the dollar in terms of news. However, when we look at the price action, we are still in a bullish run. We can see that we were tapping into this area here, lost momentum, and then had this very strong bullish candle the week before. And last week we are kind of stalling a bit, but overall it still seems that we continue higher. We go shortly down to the 4-hour. We still have this bigger picture in place. Initially, we were looking for the short somewhere in this area here with this expanding. So we broke out, had a continuation, and are now starting to move higher up. There is still this area of interest here, which is the back end of these previous lows here. There is some liquidity in this area, but however, there is enough room to the upside. And my overall bias is clearly US dollar longs for next week. We go to US dollar, Euro US dollar, and start here on the weekly as well. It's the inverse picture more or less. We can see we are in a bearish momentum run. Price last week did stall a bit, but I'm not looking for anything else than short continuation. Going down here to the 4-hour, we can see we have quite clear targets to go. We have the next target here in this area where we left the gap, starting to form a bigger continuation pattern. And ideally, I'm looking for a smaller continuation. So I'd like to see price building a second base, second low, and then coming up for a third touch in this liquidity area here. We left a small gap and then a continuation short here. However, we have some other areas to consider as well. We have this low, which more or less aligns or leaves a small gap to this liquidity point here. So if price is making a bigger structure, I'm fine with that. So even if price just goes up here and then forming a retrace and a continuation in this area, I'm good to take a short in that area. Then it would be more of a V structure, a V-shaped structure. We will see. We will play as the market gives us clues. The next one is Australian dollar, US dollar. Very similar. Again, we are still looking US dollar longs. We have this very nice reversal pattern the week before and now a follow through. The follow through ended a bit on a wick, which is not ideally, however, it's still bearish. And with the overall US dollar long sentiment, I'm looking for a short continuation. Here, going down to the 1-hour, we have a nice small consolidation here just above this previous area of interest, and now price is starting to form a structure through the previous low. So I'm looking for price to come back up into this area for a better value in terms of entry. Ideally, we get some form of structure into this liquidity area here, and just because of the size of the structure, I would look for a more weighted time frame, something like a 4-hour entry in this area. Or it's also possible that price will sell off first, and we then get a bigger structure over the week, which then would lead to some form of a 1, 2, 3 in this area. Again, a structure into this liquidity area here. But this will be my initial area of interest to consider any short plays. New Zealand dollar, US dollar. Again, very similar. You can see they are more or less identical patterns to Australian dollar, US dollar. We are through price. We have this small consolidation here. Then price broke through the previous area of interest here to the left and is now forming a bigger structure. Ideally, we see price selling off first, making a second base before then coming back up into this area, or again, also even when price is forming a nice strong base here, this might then become an override area for a potential short entry somewhere in the middle of the week. Then Australian dollar, Canadian dollar. We go here to the weekly as well. We were looking for continuation shorts last week. However, now we see that we have a very strong bullish impulsive week actually going down to the 4-hour. We were tapping into this previous area of interest here. Then price failed to continue short in this area, instead turned around and now even broke the next smaller area of interest here on the lower time frame. What I'm looking at the moment, it seems that Australian dollar is stronger than the Canadian dollar, and from the price action, I'm not surprised if we continue with the bullish momentum next week. So at the moment, as it stands right now, I'm looking for a continuation long, preferably a nice 1, 2, 3, a 3-touch continuation somewhere in this area to continue along. However, I would change my bias if price suddenly breaks impulsively below this area here and then is giving me a bear flag continuation. Then of course I would change my bias and go short. But as it looks right now, also with Australian dollar index and Canadian dollar index, it seems that the Australian dollar is gaining more momentum over the Canadian dollar for the coming week. Also, Australian dollar, New Zealand dollar looks very similar. Going to the weekly, we had this very strong impulsive bullish week before and are now stalling. So it's kind of a doji week. Price seems to build up some volume for the next move. I'm going here straight to the 4-hour. Let me clean that shortly. So we have some still a little bit room to go to the previous high, but then of course it's open for more on the top. So at the moment, price broke through this high here. Here it just left a small gap, sold off, failed to continue here, and now moved through this area fairly impulsively and is now starting to creep down a little bit more. So when we go to the lower time frame, even to the 15 minutes, just to see if we have something on the lower time frame, yeah, we have an initial impulsive movement, which left here a small liquidity point. It's a very, very weak point, but however, price is slowly approaching this area, and I'm not surprised if price would just tickle down a bit further, or maybe even into this area, and then suddenly give us an impulsive move to the upside and a small continuation to enter along. So my bias overall is Australian dollar long and New Zealand dollar short in that regard, next to the US dollar long place, of course. And we see that also in New Zealand dollar, Canadian dollar. Here it's undecided pair a bit. It could go either way, but looking on the weekly, starting from the weekly again, we had this very, very strong bearish impulsive week before. Price is now stalling. We have room to the downside. It would make sense to go into both directions. We left this obvious gap here to this previous small area of interest or a value area. We also left the gap here to this area of value, but we are still between two major value areas. So we have a major value area here and here, so price is still somewhere in the middle. But as it looks right now, price action wise, it looks more like we will see a continuation short after this very, very strong move, because the last week could not retrace a lot. So we only retraced maybe around 20% of the previous week. So going down to the 4-hour or even straight to the 1-hour, we did actually come from some area of interest here, turned around, had a small continuation here and another one here, and are now looking for either a continuation above here with the deliberate 1, 2, 3 structure for a long, which is not my preferred play, but I would be open to that if I see a very deliberate structure above this continuation structure here. My preferred move would be for price to impulsively break below or even a bit further down and then give us a bear flag continuation here for a short. Next one would be pound Australian dollar. When we say the overall picture of Australian dollar is the next stronger currency for the coming week next to the US dollar, then I'm thinking, or my bias is actually for pound Australian to go further down. We had this on watch for a few times already, and we're looking for continuation short. However, we were slightly neutral after the week before, which ended on this very, very strong week, still bearish, and then we now have a bullish week, which ended on a week, a bearish week in a bullish week, kind of, right? So it's still neutral, going down to the 1 hour. We also see we are in quite interesting areas. So it could go either way from here. We have this liquidity area. It did not break below, so it could also go from here to continue along. For that, I would change my bias if price moves impulsively above this small area of interest and then giving me a lower time frame continuation pattern, which would justify to enter along in this area, then okay. But overall, I would still prefer a short here, but also for the short, I would like to see price to initially sell off and then give me a continuation pattern, preferably retesting the lows here to enter a short in this area. If I get the same structure slightly further down, I'm also okay to take it as long as I can manage the position to this low. Then going to Euro New Zealand dollar. Euro New Zealand dollar is a bit a tricky one because in the overall picture, we are clearly still looking for the short. We had this on watch also a few times. We had this very strong washout here on this previous value area and then sold off aggressively and are now building a bigger, more complex structure. We had this, it's kind of a bearish week, which still ended bullish with this long wick into this high and finishing the expanding structure here. Expanding structures could go in both directions, and we see that towards the end of the week, price lost momentum and losing steam and turned around in this area. However, the overall bias, it's still it's kind of neutral, but my bias is for euro long over New Zealand dollar because New Zealand dollar is considered very weak for next week. So as long as price remains above this area here, I'm looking for longs. If price breaks below this area impulsively and then is giving me a bear flag continuation somewhere in this area, I'm okay to change my bias for a short. But as long as price remains here, preferably making a bigger structure, something like that, I would entertain a long in this area. Then we would have a 1, 2, 3 above this liquidity area here to enter a long. So the long is clearly my preferred way to go. US dollar, Swiss francs. We had this last week on watch already because we changed bias. Initially, we were looking for price to finish the move and close the gap. So for another short play into this low, but then we can see we were stalling in this area here for quite some time. So we see that here on the daily, we had a lot of volume accumulation in this area, and then price finally broke out and started to form a consolidation just outside this heavy volume here. So going down to the 1 hour, there is a potential to play a short into a long. We have this liquidity area here, we have two tops here, and we see that is the beginning of a 1, 2, and a potential 3 into this low. So if we get a very nice clean price action in this area to play the short into the long from this area, I'm okay to do that. Because overall, after the data from last week from US dollar, we know that in the beginning of the week, price can retrace a bit. It's also possible that the DXY might retrace a bit first and then gaining more momentum to the upside over the end of the week, which then would make sense to initially play a short on US dollar Swiss francs and then play along for the second half of the week. We still keep one Australian dollar yen pair. Actually, we still keep one yen pair in the watch list. So it's very similar to the weeks before. There's not really good opportunities at the moment. Yen still seems to get weaker. Overall, my bias is still yen should get stronger. So we see that price was initially retracing fairly heavily after the initial drop on all the pairs. We are in all the yen pairs making some bigger, more complex structures, but we are in the overall picture still in sell territory. So we are approaching interesting areas, which we see here on the 4-hour. So these are bigger structures, but we discussed that before as well. We had this very strong impulsive initial move down. We only had one more significant continuation during the whole move, which is now our liquidity area here and an area of interest. And we see prices slowly creeping up into this area. And we can also see Australian dollar yen is making a potential 3-touch structure. So we have the first here, first bottom, second high, second bottom, and are now approaching the third area here. So it's kind of a section 1, 2, and 3. And so I have it loosely on watch, so I'm not really inclined to play the long here somewhere in this area, because I see that this high here is a quite substantial area of interest, so I'm looking for a potential short in this area. It should be at least a 4-hour entry. Probably a 4-hour entry is still too small considering the size of the structure, so it might more likely be a daily entry in this area for a short, or then an initial break to the downside and the continuation on the lower time frame for a short entry in this area. So yeah, that's the watch list for next week. Yeah, thanks for watching, and see you next week. Bye bye.